The cathedral was built to make people feel small. 60-foot ceilings, walls of cold white marble, chandeliers the size of cars, each one dripping crystals that scattered light like 1,000 tiny knives across the pews. The flowers alone had cost more than most people earned in a year. Ivory peonies and ghost white orchids, flown in overnight, their scent thick and suffocating in the sealed air. 500 guests sat in silence, not the soft, reverent silence of a church, the heavy kind, the kind that happens when 500 of the most dangerous people in the Korean underworld are all watching the same thing, and none of them dare breathe wrong. Because this was not just a wedding. This was a treaty, a merger, a public declaration, broadcast to every syndicate, every cartel, every crime family from Seoul to Singapore, that Do-yeon, the boss of bosses, had finally chosen a side. His name was Do-yeon Kwon. He stood at the altar the way men like him always stood, like the room had been built around him, like the architecture had no choice but to frame him. He was broad-shouldered and impossibly still, dressed in a bespoke gray suit that moved like armored silk when he breathed. His jaw was sharp. His expression was sharper. His dark eyes did not scan the crowd the way other men's eyes did. They simply rested, heavy and certain, on the doors at the far end of the aisle. He did not look like a man in love. He looked like a man executing a strategy. The music swelled. A live orchestra, 40 instruments strong, and the doors opened. Ryung appeared. The crowd rose. She was the picture of inherited power. Her gown was custom lace, off the shoulder, a design that had taken a team of 12 artisans 4 months to complete. A diamond collar rested against her throat, like a crown that had simply slipped downward. Her hair was sculpted into a flawless updo, not a strand daring to disobey. She walked with the practiced grace of a woman who had been rehearsing this exact moment since she was old enough to understand what her family's wealth could buy. Her smile was perfect. Her eyes were cold. The guests settled. The officiator raised his hands. The final notes of the music dissolved into cathedral air. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. And then, from the side corridor, past the row of stone-faced syndicate soldiers, past the armed guards stationed every 6 feet along the walls, a door opened that was not supposed to open. And a woman walked out, who was not supposed to be there. She wore a black button-down shirt buttoned to the collar, a white catering apron tied neatly at her waist. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, simple bun, not styled for the event, but contained for a long shift. She was not dressed for this room. She was not dressed for this life, but she walked like she owned every inch of it. Her name was Felicia, and she was carrying a plain white envelope in both hands. The soldiers saw her first. Hands moved to weapons. Bodies shifted. The kind of silent, synchronized threat response that happened when $500 of training activated at once. But before a single gun cleared its holster, Do-yeon raised one gloved hand. One hand. Barely a gesture. And every soldier in the room went still. The crowd felt the shift. The music was gone. The officiator had stopped speaking. Ryung had turned from the altar, her perfect smile faltering. Not gone yet, not destroyed yet, but cracked at the corner, like fine porcelain struck by something it hadn't expected. Felicia didn't stop. She didn't look at the guests. She didn't look at the bride. She didn't look at the soldiers frozen mid-reach around her. She walked the full length of that velvet aisle with her eyes on one person, and one person only. She stopped 2 feet from the most powerful man in Seoul. She held out the envelope. Her hands were perfectly steady. Ryung laughed. A sound like cut glass, sharp and dismissive. "Remove this trash," she said, not to Do-yeon, but to the room, to the guards, to anyone willing to take the order. Nobody moved. Do-yeon looked at the envelope. Then he looked at Felicia's face. Something moved behind his eyes. Not recognition. Not yet. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting in the dark for 4 years, pressed under syndicate business and empire strategy, and all the things a man tells himself when he's trying to forget the 1 week that broke him open. He took the envelope. He opened it. The cathedral went so quiet you could hear the candles burn. And then those ice-cold eyes, the eyes that had sentenced men, ended families, redrawn borders with a word, snapped up from the paper, and found Felicia, and did not look away. Ryung's smile was gone. The wedding was over. The reckoning had begun. But if you want to know what was in that envelope, and what Felicia had been carrying, alone for 4 years, then keep watching. Because this isn't a story about a wedding being destroyed. This is a story about a woman who walked into the most dangerous room in the world armed with nothing but the truth, and watched an empire fall to its knees. Stay with me. It's only going to get better from here. She wasn't supposed to find him. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell this story later. How close it was to never happening at all. One different decision. One main road instead of one back alley. And Felicia walks past that dumpster. Do-Yun bleeds out alone in the dark. And there is no Zola. There is no reckoning. There is no envelope. There is nothing. But Felicia was a third-year nursing student with $40 in her account, a pharmacology exam in 6 hours, and a bone-deep resistance to taking the long way home. So she cut through the alley behind Mapogu Hospital at 2 a.m. the way she always did, fast, eyes forward. 12 hours already gone from her shift and not a single one of them given back. She almost stepped over him. He was propped against the brick wall between 2 dumpsters, one hand pressed flat against his ribs, the other wrapped around nothing. Whatever weapon he'd carried was long gone. He was bleeding, not dramatically, not the way it looked in films, but steadily, methodically, the body quietly and persistently losing an argument it couldn't afford to lose. She stopped. Every rational part of her brain fired at once. His jacket alone said danger. The way he held himself, even now, even injured and alone in an alley at 2 a.m, carried the posture of a man who had never once in his life been in a room he didn't own. Men like that didn't end up bleeding in alleys by accident. She knelt beside him anyway. "Don't," he said. His Korean was low, precise, unhurried even now. "You don't want to be near me right now." She looked at the blood soaking through his fingers, looked at his face, made a calculation that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the fact that she had spent 3 years learning exactly what to do in this situation, and she was constitutionally incapable of walking away from it. "You're bleeding through your intercostal space," she said in Korean. Medical vocabulary first, social grace later. "Puncture wound. You've got maybe 40 minutes before this becomes a crisis." She pulled the clean cloth from her bag, pressed it against his side without asking permission. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. He let her. Here's what she didn't know yet about the man she was saving. His name was Do-Yun Kwon, and 3 rival syndicates had spent the last 6 months trying to kill him. He was 28 years old and had already buried 2 predecessors. The 4 men who'd found him in that alley had been paid 2 million won apiece to make sure he didn't walk out of Mapogu. They believed they'd succeeded. They were wrong. Because of a nursing student who took the short way home. His name, he told her 3 hours later in a borrowed studio apartment, was Do-Yun. Just Do-Yun. She did not push for more because she had already seen the scar along his jaw that hadn't come from any accident, and she understood. Some doors were not built for her to open. But he stayed. She told herself it was practical. He needed monitoring. The wound was serious. The risk of infection real. She was a nursing student. This was just medicine. She almost believed it by day 2. By day 3, he had stopped pretending to sleep on the couch. 7 days. That was all. 7 days sealed in a small apartment while Seoul turned outside without them. And somewhere in that sealed, suspended week, something happened between two people that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them could explain away. He was careful with her. Not soft. Do-yoon was not built for soft. But deliberate. Like he was making decisions about her, slowly and with full attention, the way he made every decision. Like she was something he wanted to understand completely before he was required to leave. On the 7th morning, she woke up, and the door was open. 4 men in the hallway. Not police. Something older and quieter than police. Do-yoon was already standing at the doorframe, dressed and composed in the way of a man who had been awake for hours preparing for exactly this moment. He looked back at her once. "I'm sorry," he said. And then, because he believed in precision even when it cost him, "I won't forget this." The door closed. She stood in the empty apartment. She told herself 7 days wasn't long enough to mean anything permanent. 3 weeks later, she found out she was pregnant. She sent the first letter to the address he'd written on the corner of a takeout bag on day 3 of the 7. A moment when he'd trusted her enough to stop pretending he didn't have an address. No response. She sent the second a month later, then the third in February, the fourth in March. By which point she could feel Zola's presence, small and insistent and entirely real, and had started to understand that the silence was its own kind of answer. She told herself, he made his choice. Men like that always had other plans. She stopped writing. She did not stop surviving. She worked double shifts through the pregnancy. She converted the apartment's single closet into a nursery by sheer force of creative problem-solving. She passed her nursing board 6 weeks after Zola was born, sitting the exam on 4 hours of sleep with a breast pump in her bag, because Zola's future required her to. She built everything. Alone. On purpose. Because Felicia had learned early that waiting for rescue was the fastest way to drown. But here's what she never knew. Couldn't have known. While she was doing all of that surviving, every single letter had arrived, and every single letter had been burned. The catering company booked her for a 12-hour shift at a rate 30% above her usual. Her supervisor said, "Big client, don't ask questions." Felicia said nothing, pressed her uniform, tied her apron, and showed up at 6 in the morning because Zola's specialist appointment was in 2 weeks, and the payment plan was already behind. She spent the first 4 hours in the kitchen. She was not supposed to be in the ceremony corridor. But at hour 5, they were short-staffed on champagne service, and someone had to cover the floor, and that someone turned out to be her. She moved through the corridor with her tray, eyes down, professional, efficient. And then she passed a chair with a wedding program on it. Do-yoon Kwon and Ryung Chae, union ceremony. She read it once. She read it again. She set down her tray very carefully on the nearest surface, because her hands had done something involuntary and she needed a moment to overrule them. He was here. He was here and getting married, and she was at his wedding, and Zola was home with a babysitter and... Stop. Breathe. You have a job. You have a shift. You have a payment plan that doesn't care about your history. She picked the tray back up, kept her head level, kept her eyes away from the altar. Did not think about the address on the corner of a takeout bag. Did not think about 7 days. Did not think about 4 letters. She almost made it through the whole shift. She was crossing the hall with a fresh tray of glasses when the foot appeared. Not an accident. Accidents are random. This was geometry. A heel placed at the precise angle required to intercept her ankle and redirect everything forward. Irreversible. No recovery possible. The tray went first. Crystal detonated across marble. Felicia went down on one knee, both palms catching the floor, champagne soaking immediately into the white apron she'd pressed that morning. The laughter was immediate, politely muffled from the guests. And then one voice rising above it, unhurried, not even bothering to face her fully. "Someone clean that up, and remove this girl before she embarrasses anyone further." Ryung adjusted the diamond collar at her throat with 2 fingers. Didn't look down. Like Felicia was furniture that had fallen over and was now someone else's problem. Clumsy, she added, softer, directed at the women around her. They really will hire anyone. Felicia looked up from the floor and looked directly at Do-yun. He was 10 feet away at the edge of the hall, and he was already watching her. Had been watching her. She understood it the moment their eyes connected, with an expression she hadn't seen in 4 years. That locked, calculating stillness. The look he got when he was updating everything. He saw her fall. He didn't move. She told herself that didn't mean what it looked like. She told herself there were 100 reasons a man didn't step forward in a room full of syndicate soldiers. She told herself she didn't care. She cared. And then Ryung laughed again, and something in Felicia's chest, something she had been carefully, successfully suppressing for 4 years, went absolutely, dangerously quiet. She reached into her apron pocket. She should have walked out. Taken the shame, collected her pay, gone home to Zola. Every rational instinct pointed to the exit. She chose wrong. Or maybe, just maybe, she chose exactly right. She had been carrying the envelope since 6 that morning. She'd found the wedding program online during Zola's breakfast, a society page announcement with the venue, the time, the names, and she'd sat at the kitchen table for 11 minutes while Zola ate cereal, and the specialist bill sat on the counter, and she'd made a decision she still wasn't sure she believed in. She'd put the DNA test in her apron pocket. She'd gone to work. She'd told herself she'd decide later whether to use it. Later arrived when Ryung's foot moved into her path. The aisle felt longer from inside it than it had looked from the side corridor. She was viscerally aware of the soldiers, bodies shifting, hands going to holsters. And she heard the room change as she passed the last pew. The officiator had stopped. The orchestra had stopped. 500 of the most dangerous people in the Korean underworld had stopped, all at once, and were watching a waitress in a champagne-soaked apron walk toward the altar. Do-yun raised his hand. One hand. Barely a gesture. Every soldier went still. She stopped 2 feet from him, held out the envelope. From behind her. Do-yun, don't. This is nothing. This is some desperate... He opened it. He read it. The room held its breath. And then, Do-yun Kwon, the man who had never in any documented history shown surprise in public, looked up from that paper with something raw moving behind his eyes. Not anger. Something older than anger. Something that looked, against all odds, like recognition. Clear the cathedral, he said. The vestry smelled of old wood and candle wax. 2 guards outside the closed door. Inside, just the 2 of them, and 4 years of silence that had nowhere left to go. Do-yun set the DNA test on the table. He did not look at it again. Why didn't you tell me? I did. Felicia's voice was level. She'd rehearsed this conversation hundreds of times in her head. Never imagined it would happen in a church vestry while champagne dried on her apron. But here they were. 4 letters, the address you gave me. I waited 3 months, and when nothing came back, I stopped. His jaw shifted. What address? She described it. The street, the building number, the way he'd written it fast on the corner of the bag, like he was trying to commit to something before he could talk himself out of it. Do-yun was quiet for a long time. I never received them. I know that now. The silence between them reorganized itself into something with sharper edges. How long? He said. Alone. Since before she was born. He turned away, pressed both hands flat against the table. She watched his shoulders and thought, this is the moment. This is when he calculates the inconvenience, weighs the disruption against the obligation, decides what he can afford. She was wrong about what he was calculating. Her name, he said. Zola. How old? Almost 4. He turned back around. His face was still controlled. His eyes were not. "I want to see her," he said, and it wasn't a request. Transformation. 3 hours ago, he was a groom. Now he was standing at the door of a 6-unit walk-up in Mapogu, looking at a pair of tiny sneakers by the door and a refrigerator covered in crayon drawings, and something in his face was doing something she had never seen it do. The babysitter collected her things without a word and left. Zola was asleep on the couch under a cartoon, bear blanket, one small fist pressed against her cheek. Duyun stopped in the middle of the room. He went the particular kind of still that happened when something bypassed every defense he'd built and landed somewhere unprotected. She watched it happen. Watched him look at the jawline, the arch of the brow, and then Zola stirred, the way children do. That slow surface from sleep, awareness gathering, and opened her eyes. His eyes. Exactly his eyes. The same dark gravity, the same quality of stillness in them, as if even at 3 years old this child had inherited her father's particular relationship with waiting. "Mama." Not afraid, just orienting. "I'm here, it's okay." Zola looked at Doyun with the frank, completely unfiltered assessment of a child who had not yet learned to be diplomatic about curiosity. She looked him over from head to toe. Gray suit, sharp jaw, standing in her living room at what was now close to midnight, looking like he'd walked out of a different world entirely. "Who are you?" Doyun Kwan, who had sat across the table from generals, who had held the future of entire criminal territories in his hands without blinking, went down to one knee on a kitchen floor between a pair of tiny sneakers and a stack of unpaid medical bills. "My name is Doyun." His voice was not controlled. For the first time in 4 years, possibly longer, it was just honest. "I'm your father." Zola looked at him for a long time, then she looked at Felicia, then back at Doyun. "You're late," she said. And somewhere behind his eyes, something that had been locked for 4 years finally, quietly, opened. While Felicia put Zola back to sleep, Doyun made one phone call. Taejin picked up on the first ring. That was all Doyun needed to say. Taejin was not a man who needed instructions spelled out. He had been Doyun's right hand for 15 years on the specific basis that he understood what was required before it was asked for. He went to the syndicate's sole mailroom at 11 that night, alone, with 2 objectives: find out what happened to 4 letters sent across a 3-year period, and come back with proof that would hold in front of the council. He was back by 1 in the morning. The proof was 43 minutes of audio, recorded on a device smaller than a thumbnail. A mailroom supervisor's voice, exhausted and frightened, filling in details he had spent 4 years training himself not to think about. Doyun listened to all 43 minutes without moving. Here's what the recording said. Madame Chai, Ryung's mother, had contacted the mailroom 14 months before the wedding. She hadn't used her name. She'd used money. 3 clean wire transfers to an account that would take serious forensic work to trace back to her, but which Taejin had already traced. The instruction was simple. Any letter arriving for Doyun Kwan from a Felicia Adeyemi was to be intercepted. Not held. Not returned. Not set aside somewhere a conscience might find it. Burned. All 4 letters. Gone. In the Korean syndicate world, controlling a boss's information is the oldest power move there is. You don't challenge a man like Doyun with weapons. Not directly. You challenge him by controlling what he knows. Madame Che didn't just burn 4 letters. She burned 4 years of his life and called it strategy. Doyun pressed stop on the recording. "The letters," he said. "She wrote 4. Yes. And Madame Che had them destroyed before I ever—" He stopped. Reorganized. "How long before the engagement was she watching my correspondence?" Taejin's answer was flat and precise. "The first payment predates the engagement by 6 weeks. 6 weeks before negotiations started, which meant they had known about Felicia before any contract was signed. Which meant every alliance, Every territorial agreement, every strategic structure built around the Quan Chai Union, all of it had been constructed on top of a secret Madame Che had been paying to keep buried. Du Yun stood up. Get me everything, every transfer, every name, every thread. What Tae Jin brought back an hour later was worse than the letters. The building where Felicia lived had changed ownership 8 months ago. The new owner was a property holding company registered in Busan. No public directors, no website, no traceable phone number. The kind of entity that exists specifically to be invisible when someone goes looking. It was owned, through 2 careful layers of subsidiary structures, by the Chai family estate. Tae Jin laid the document on the table. Du Yun read it once. He read it again. Because the first reading got him the fact. The second reading got him the shape of it. The specific patient architecture of what Madame Che had built. Because this wasn't about money. The Che family did not need rental income from a 6-unit walk-up in Mapogu. What they needed was a mechanism. A lever positioned and loaded and ready to pull. At any moment of their choosing, they could file an eviction notice. 30 days. A nursing student with a toddler and a specialist payment plan. Out. Gone from the city before the wedding, before any disruption was possible, before Do Yun could ever be confronted with what he'd missed. They had known about Zola. Not just Felicia. Zola. A child who hadn't yet turned one when they bought that building, who had never done anything to anyone, whose entire existence they had decided was a threat to be managed and removed. That was the part that landed last and hardest. Not just the letters, not just the cover-up. This. A family that had looked at an infant and a struggling single mother and decided the cleanest solution was to quietly own the building under their feet and wait. Du Yun was still for a very long time. Tae Jin, who had watched this man make cold decisions under conditions that would break other people. Tsi felt something he rarely felt in this work. Genuine unease. The council, Do Yun said. When has Madame Che called it for? Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. Good. His voice was completely, terrifyingly level. And Tae Jin understood without needing it explained that good was not the word it sounded like. The Council of Wolves met in a building that appeared on no public map. 12 elders, 12 territories, 12 people who had survived long enough in the Korean underworld to carry the specific, settled authority of those who had simply outlasted everyone who ever threatened them. They sat at a circular table in a windowless room, under lighting calibrated to make everyone look simultaneously powerful and mortal. Madame Che had called this session. She stood at the head of the room in charcoal silk, composed and precise, hands folded. A woman who had decided the outcome and was here to announce it. Ryung sat to her left, the wedding gown traded for structured black, her expression rebuilt from last night's fracture into something colder and more deliberate. Their case was clean, on paper. Du Yun had agreed to a marriage alliance ratified by 3 council members. Territories, financial structures, debt arrangements. Half the syndicate's operations ran through agreements built on this union. Canceling it unilaterally, without council-recognized cause, wasn't personal. It was a breach with real institutional consequences. Madame Che presented all of this in measured, authoritative language. She was good. She had been doing this for 30 years and she knew exactly which words to use and which faces to make when she used them. The elders listened. She thought she had the room. She thought she'd controlled the variables. She thought the letters were gone and the recording didn't exist, and the woman in the waitress uniform had no weapon that could reach this table. She was so wrong it was almost elegant. The doors opened. Du Yun walked in. And behind him, not behind him, beside him, matching his pace exactly, chin level, posture absolute, was Felicia. The room did what rooms do when they encounter something they hadn't accounted for. She was dressed in structured syndicate black, selected in 3 hours by people who understood that she was not attending this meeting as a guest or a witness or a complication. At her throat, her wrists, her ears, stones from Do-Yun's personal collection. Pieces that every person at this table would recognize on sight, not because of their beauty, but because of what they communicated about the man who had placed them there. Ryung's rebuilt expression developed a fault line. Madame Che's hands stayed folded, but something behind her eyes moved fast. Do-Yun sat at the opposite head of the table. Felicia took the chair to his right, the chair that had been empty at every council session in recorded syndicate history, because it had never, until this moment, had a permanent occupant. "You called this session," Do-Yun said to Madame Che. "Speak." She spoke. She was composed, authoritative, careful with every word. She referred to Felicia as an external complication, to the cancelled wedding as a destabilizing personal disruption, to the alliance as a commitment that transcended individual circumstance. She never once used Felicia's name. She never once acknowledged the child. It was a very good performance. When she finished, Do-Yun did not stand. He set a small device on the table. He pressed play. 43 minutes of audio existed. Do-Yun played 11 of them, the 11 that mattered. The mailroom supervisor's voice, tired and past pretending, filling the windowless room with names, dates, dollar amounts, and one specific instruction. Not held, not returned, not delayed. Burned. Madame Che's name, the dates, the transfers, all of it. Nobody at the table spoke. When the recording stopped, Do-Yun looked at Madame Che with the quality of attention he reserved for problems he had already solved. "You knew about my child before the engagement was negotiated," he said. "You destroyed the evidence. Then you purchased her building, not for investment, but for control. You positioned yourself to remove my daughter from this city on 30 days' notice if she became inconvenient." He paused once. "You tried to erase my heir." Madame Che's voice, when she found it. "You have one interpretation of... I have a recording, property documentation, and wire transfer records with your family's name on them." He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The marriage agreement was negotiated in bad faith. Under council law, any alliance built on deliberate concealment of material information is void from inception. Elder Park, the oldest person at the table, the one who had been in that chair since before most people in the room were born, looked at Madame Che with an expression that had finished with judgment and arrived somewhere final. "Is the recording authentic?" Not to Do-Yun, to Madame Che. Silence. Madame Che. Ryung moved involuntarily. A small shift, the body responding before the mind could authorize it. And Madame Che pressed her folded hands tighter together and said nothing. Which was its own answer. 11 heads moved around the table. Do-Yun removed 3 documents from the folder in front of him and read from them without theater. The Che clan's eastern territories reverted to council administration. Their positions in the Busan and Incheon operations dissolved. The property in Mapo-gu transferred to Felicia Adeyemi, free and clear, effective immediately. Ryung made a sound, short, airless, the sound of someone watching a floor vanish, and Madame Che's hands finally, for the first time in the session, came apart. They were shaking. "You have nothing," Do-Yun told them. Quiet. Absolute. The tone of a man closing a door that would not open again. "You built an empire on a lie. This is what remains of it." Future video. What happens to syndicate families stripped of their territories? The underground economy of fallen Korean crime dynasties. Who picks up the pieces, and at what cost? The convoy left Seoul before dawn. Zola slept against Felicia's side for the first hour, one small fist pressed to her cheek, entirely unbothered by the black vehicles and the armed men and the fact that her entire life had restructured itself in the past 18 hours. Children were like that. They slept through the earthquakes and woke up asking for breakfast. Felicia watched the city dissolve behind the windows, the density of it, the lit buildings, the traffic, the noise. Thinning and then gone, replaced by roads that narrowed and then by trees. Pine. Dark and dense and silent in the way cities never were. She didn't ask where they were going. She understood, without needing it said, that the direction was away. Away from the building Madame Che had tried to weaponize, away from the payment plans and the double shifts, and the 4 years of building a life strong enough to carry everything alone, because she had decided a long time ago that waiting for help was just a more comfortable way of drowning. Away from all of that. Toward something she hadn't let herself name yet. The estate came out of the dark in stages. A gate. A road. Then architecture that didn't announce itself because it had never needed to. Stone and glass and the settled permanence of a place built to last. Inside, warmth, and staff who had been expecting them without being told, who moved efficiently and disappeared without ceremony. A child's room. Tae-jin had made calls during the drive, with a bed exactly the right size, soft enough that Zola transferred into it without waking. Felicia stood in that doorway for a long time, her daughter, asleep, safe, in a house that could not be bought, out from under her by anyone. She stood there until she was certain she wasn't going to cry, and then she went back downstairs. Do-yeon was at the fireplace. He had the waitress uniform in his hands. She'd packed it without thinking. It had been clean and pressed, and she hadn't known how long they'd be away, and old habits were stubborn. Now she looked at it in his hands and understood, with absolute clarity, that she would never press that apron again. That the woman who had tied it around her waist at 6 a.m. and walked into that cathedral was not the woman standing in this room. He fed it into the fire. The white apron went first, then the black shirt, the careful creases dissolving into nothing. He watched it burn without ceremony, no speech, no performance. Just a man removing something from the world that had been in it too long. When it was ash, he turned to her. She had braced for eloquence, for the kind of carefully constructed declaration a man like Do-yeon would deliver to something this significant, a strategy wrapped in language. Instead, he went to one knee. Not the way men kneel to propose, not with a ring and a practiced sentence and the soft anticipation of yes. The way soldiers kneel, the way people kneel when they owe something that money can't reach and have decided to offer the only thing that can't be taken back. His hands were open at his sides. "I cost you 4 years," he said. "I cannot return them." He looked up, and what was on his face was the thing she'd spent 4 years trying not to wonder about. What was underneath all that armor, all that control, all that syndicate authority? Just the face beneath it. Just Do-yeon. "What I can do is make certain that nothing and no one ever costs you another day. Not one." Felicia looked at him. She thought about the alley and the 7 days and the 4 letters that never arrived. She thought about Zola asking why she didn't have a father like the other kids and Felicia not having a single honest answer. She thought about tonight, the council chamber, the documents, the way 11 heads had moved without hesitation when Do-yeon laid out the truth. And she understood something she hadn't let herself understand before. He had been looking for the same thing she'd been building toward. He'd just had to wait for her to walk down an aisle with an envelope to find it. She let out a breath that had been held for 4 years. "Get up," she said. He did. "You don't swear loyalty to a queen and then stay on the floor," she said. "That's not how this works." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Do-yeon did not traffic in smiles, had never been built for them. But the deliberate, controlled allowance of something he had been keeping locked. Something that, for the first time, he had decided didn't need to be locked anymore. He stood. He was close enough that she could see the firelight catch the gray of his suit, the sharp angle of his jaw, The dark gravity of eyes that were Zola's eyes and had been searching in their own armored way, since the moment a door opened in a cathedral, and a woman in a white apron chose to walk toward him instead of away. Outside, the mountain was silent. Inside, Zola was asleep in a room that no one could take, in a house that no eviction notice could touch, in a life that a woman had spent 4 years building from nothing and was only now, finally, completely, being given its full foundation. The apron was ash. The reckoning was finished. Everyone thought the envelope was the weapon. Everyone thought the DNA test was how she won. But the truth? Felicia had been winning since the moment she knelt beside a bleeding man in an alley and chose to stay. The envelope just made it visible. The throne had always been hers. She had simply been the only one who hadn't claimed it yet. If you made it to the end, if something in Felicia's story felt like yours, drop a black heart below. Not because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because I want to know how many of us there are. People who built everything alone and are only now learning it's okay to let someone stand next to what you built. Subscribe. Hit the bell. The next story is already written, and I'll tell you this much. It starts somewhere completely different and ends somewhere you won't see coming. You've been here the whole time. I see you. See you in the next one. Asterisk.